Welcome. Welcome to our epic first Tanner Talk of the year. I'm Scott Black, director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and I'm delighted to introduce Daniel Mendelsohn, who will be talking about his new translation of the Odyssey. I'm also delighted to see so many of you and so much enthusiasm for classical literature and the humanities. Earlier today, Eta Sigma Phi and students in the Classics program completed a 2-day public reading of Dr. Mendelsohn's translation of the Odyssey, the Homerathon. And it's clear that the classics are alive and well. The Odyssey has been a foundational text for world culture for many reasons. It's a source of many of our favorite genres, from adventure stories, rom-com, and fantasy, to self-reflexive meta-narrative. For centuries, it has been a key teaching text for moral and literary education. But perhaps most importantly, the Odyssey is a work that reflects on its own tradition. The Iliad celebrated the strength and power of the great warrior Achilles. The Odyssey asks, in contrast, is that really what greatness is? In the Odyssey, the ghost of Achilles declares he'd give up his posthumous glory for more life, even as a tenant farmer. Both of these values are part of the epic tradition, stories of conflict and victory, as well as stories of ingenuity and reflection. The Odyssean hero is not defined by his power, but by his cleverness, his ability to think again, and reconsider what he thinks he knows. More generally, the Odyssey asks us to reflect on inherited values, to update and adapt our traditions for ourselves. That's why every new translation and every new reading serves to continue its tradition. Dr. Mendelsohn is one of our best contemporary guides to the Odyssey. His many essays and books span a broad range of topics, from classical literature to pop culture and memoir. And he is a superb stylist whose writing achieves that magical balance between deep scholarship, critical insight, elegance, and accessibility that keeps the humanities alive. Dr. Mendelsohn is Charles Ranlett Flint Professor of Humanities at Bard College. His wonderful book, An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, tells the story of his father taking his seminar at Bard alongside his own quest to understand his father. At once a telemachiad and a modern exploration of the Homeric questions of identity, family, and love, the book is my favorite way to introduce the Odyssey to students. Because the Odyssey is at once a poem about identity, loyalty, and the proper shape of a good society in a post-heroic world, and a story of love in its many varieties, and how we know and recognize each other across distance, time, and age. I'm delighted to welcome Daniel Mendelsohn to talk with us about the Odyssey and its continuing legacy.
Thank you, Scott, for that generous introduction. So I think the way that this is going to work is I'm going to talk for about 15 or 20 minutes, just sort of introducing some of what went into creating a new translation of a poem that's been translated many, many times. And then I think we're going to talk on stage and sort of roll up our sleeves, so to speak, and get into the nitty-gritty of some of the themes of the poem and why we keep reading it. But I thought what I might do with you is just sort of describe some of the challenges involved in translating a work like the Odyssey. So I should start by saying that there have been 60 translations of the Odyssey into English since the end of the Second World War, which immediately raises the question, why do we need another one? And as I always like to say, they asked me and they paid me. But the actual, the real reason, those are true, is that it was not my idea. And I think it's very important to remember, especially when you're talking about translations of great classics that have been translated already many times, that a lot of the translations happen for reasons other than the ones you might imagine. So the first reason that you might imagine, or the most common one, is, well, Mendelsohn was walking around for years thinking, nobody has translated the Odyssey the way it should be translated, and I'm going to solve all the problems. And that's actually not the case. I think, translation, particularly of a work that is, so important and has been translated so many times into so many languages, is a sort of, I always say it's a collaborative rather than a competitive process. Every translation feeds off of previous translation. Translators are always looking at each other's works, building on each other's works. I was not motivated by a sense that there was something wrong that needed to be corrected. And in fact, what happened was, Scott was just describing this memoir that I wrote, published in 2017, which was about a real experience when my then 82-year-old father announced that he wanted to be a student in my freshman Odyssey seminar at Bard College in upstate New York, where I teach. And so that's obviously a comic setup. I said to him, well, what are you going to do? Or are you going to... And he said, oh, don't worry, I'm just going to sit in the back. I won't say a word. That didn't last very long. As I describe in the book, on day one, he started challenging me. My dad was a scientist. He didn't know anything about the Odyssey, but he felt like he had more to say about it than I did. So since the Odyssey is partly about fathers and sons, it turned out to be a very Odyssean experience. But for the purposes of that book, which traces the course of this very unusual year, which turned out to be the last year of my dad's life, in which he took my Odyssey class, interacted with the students, taught me a lot of things about the Odyssey I didn't really know about. And then at the end of that semester, we went on a cruise that recreated the voyages of Odysseus. And that was quite a story. And for the purposes of that book, I translated small snippets of the epic. And what happened was an editor at the University of Chicago Press read my book and liked the translations that I had done. And it turned out that University of Chicago Press has the most prestigious series of translations of the classics into English, the Greek classics. The standard translation, for example, of Greek tragedies is the Chicago Greek Tragedy. Chicago published the now canonical translation of the Iliad by Richmond Lattimore in the early 1960s. And Lattimore was supposed to do an Odyssey for them, but his editor moved from Chicago to a commercial publishing house, and he followed his editor. So when his Odyssey was finally published, it was not published by Chicago, and they never had an Odyssey. So it was purely a publishing decision. What made it interesting to me is that they contacted me within months of the publication of my memoir, which is on sale by mistake outside of this room because the publisher sent an Odyssey instead of the Odyssey, but you should still get it. I had been thinking, obviously, a lot about the Odyssey. I've been teaching the Odyssey for now 36 years. I've written as a critic over the years about translation very often. I'm very interested in the mechanics of translation. And so when they called me one cold January night in 2018 to ask me if I was interested in doing a new translation, I said yes. I thought that would be fun. And 6.5 years later, I turned in the manuscript. And so I just want to say at the outset some of the things that I was interested in. Every translator approaches a work with a set of preoccupations, let's call them. Not every translator is interested in the same problems, and that's one of the reasons it's always interesting to have new translations. So one of the things I was very interested in, for example, in Greek, so the Odyssey is a poem. It's composed of 12,110 lines of verse. All of them have the same rhythm, a very strict rhythm, which all Greek and Latin epic poetry has the same line, the same beat. And it's a very long line. It's theoretically a 17-syllable line that has 6 beats. I wanted to do a line-for-line translation, more or less. You can't always match it because English works differently from Greek, but in general, I was trying to match the lines. Homer's lines are very long, and typically, historically, when the Odyssey has been translated into English, the rhythm that is very natural to English poetry is something called blank verse. It's a 10-syllable line. Ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. That's a very typical line of a very common English meter or rhythm. Homer's line is twice as long as that. Almost twice as long. Homer's line has a kind of waltz-like rhythm. Bum, 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 bum. That's one line, right? So it's a much more elastic, rhythmical, rolling line. And because I was doing a line-for-line translation, there was no way. So, and Greek, I know there are a lot of English teachers in the room, and you'll just have to forgive me for saying that, but Greek is a language I can do a lot more than English because it has a very complicated verbal system, a highly sophisticated verbal system. So, for example, in Greek, you can express the thought to the soldiers who are about to be slaughtered, which is a thing that happens, in one word. Okay, so you have a very long line filled with words, each one of which express ideas that you would need a whole line in English just to get that one word. So I thought the way to do this is to have a very long English line, to sort of try to transpose as much of what I was seeing in each Greek line into the English line. So that's a very distinctive feature of my translation because very few people have tried to do that. In fact, the last person who tried to do something like that was Richmond Lattimore back in 1962. So that was one feature. I was also, because I'm a writer and I care about how my words sound, I tried to be very attentive to Homer's sound effects. So like any poet, Homer uses the sounds of words to make some effects. So for example, there's a line in which a character is bemoaning the fact that Odysseus, who's been gone for 20 years and everyone thinks he's dead, hasn't popped up in 20 years, and they're decrying the fact that his elderly father has been reduced to a state of perpetual mourning for his son whom he thinks is dead. And in that line, they say he's just sitting there like a bag of bones, his flesh shriveling as he ages and mourns. And Homer loads that line with lots of shrivelly sounds, lots of shh and khs and, lots of aspirated sounds. So you almost hear the flesh shriveling off the bones. So I was trying to be very attentive to those kinds of things. There's a famous passage, so you might have heard the famous story of how Odysseus' wife, Penelope, is trying to fend off these 108 young hormonal guys who are trying to marry her. And she has a famous trick, right? She says, I will marry one of you once I finish weaving this funeral shroud for my father-in-law, who happens to be the guy with the flesh shriveling off his bones. And every day she's madly weaving away, but every night she's secretly unweaving the day's weaving, so the process will never end and she will keep them at bay. And in the passage where she is telling them that she is weaving a funeral shroud, the passage is loaded with a long A sound, A, because she's talking about mourning and funerals, and A in Greek has a very plaintive sound. So a lot of the words that Homer uses in this passage are filled with this A sound. It's very, very kind of plaintive. And so here's the kind of thing that keeps translators awake at night. So originally, I translated the passage with lots of A sounds. Robert Fagles, in his translation, does the same thing. He's looking very closely at the sound of the Greek, not just the meaning of the Greek. And he recreates it. The problem is, and this is what keeps me up at night, is A in English is a happy sound, right? Hooray, yay, right? So I transposed it in my translation to lots of ooh and O sounds, which in English are more sad and mourning. So just to give you an idea of the kinds of things you're thinking about as a translator, it's not just the meaning of the words. There is a whole lot going on. You have to think this is poetry. You have to think about the line. You have to think about how things sound. Homer also makes a lot of use of in poetry quite often, so you can express a thought and it can be contained within a single line, right? Something there is that doesn't love a wall, to quote a famous poem by Robert Frost, right? That's a complete thought that is contained within a complete line. But there's something else you can do, which is run the thought over the end of one line and onto the beginning of the next line. And when that happens, the first word of the next line bears a lot of weight. So you could rewrite Robert Frost, as I once did for a PowerPoint presentation, and you can have something there is that really doesn't love, end of line, a wall, right? And you see how different that is? Boom, you land on the word wall, and that becomes the word you're thinking about. Homer does that to very great effect. And one of the words that he likes to land on as the first word of a new line, and so you're paying a lot of attention to it, is the word home. Because that's one of the most important words in the Odyssey, because he's trying to get home. And that's something else I try to recreate in my translation. So I'm not going to go on much longer, but I thought I would just read you one passage just to give you a sense of how my translation sounds, even though you can't buy it outside, but you can buy it on Amazon. Just to give you a sense of what I'm up to, and I'm going to read, it's a very famous passage. So when Odysseus finally comes home, he comes home in disguise because he doesn't know who's been naughty and who's been nice while he's been away. He doesn't even know that Penelope has remained faithful to him. After all, the only other homecoming story he hears on his way home is how the leader of the Greek army in the Trojan War, Agamemnon, came home and was murdered by his wife and her adulterous lover. So he thinks, maybe I shouldn't have an Eisenhower-like victory parade. Maybe I should come home in secret and first find out if she's faithful, if the people have remained faithful. And he is disguised as an elderly beggar, which is to say the lowest form of social life in this culture. And he approaches his own palace for the first time after 20 years, but he has to keep repressing he can't say, oh, look, it's my palace, because then they'll know who he is. And as he approaches the palace, someone recognizes him. It's a very famous scene. So he's gone down to the palace with one of the field slaves, the guy who takes care of the pigs, this very nice character called Eumaeus. And the two of them are walking towards the palace, and that's where this scene picks up. Saying such things, so they've been talking, saying such things as these, the two of them went on talking. Now a dog that was lying close by raised his head and pricked up his ears. Argos, who belonged to Odysseus of the steadfast mind, he himself had raised him with no chance to enjoy him, for long before that he'd gone off to awesome Ilion. In days gone by, the young men would bring him as they hunted down wild goats and roe deer and hares. But now he lay there, missed by no one since his master had gone away, deep in the dung that was piled high in front of the palace doors, the dung of mules and cattle which Odysseus's slaves would bring out to the huge estate to spread around on the fields. So there lay Argos, flash, riddled with vermin, that plague of dogs. Now, though, as soon as he sensed that Odysseus was close by, look, he wagged his tail and both his ears went flat. But after, he hadn't the strength to come closer to his master, who looked in the other direction and brushed away a tear which he easily hid from Eumaeus, whom he questioned straight away. Eumaeus, how very odd that this dog lies in the dung. His body shows beautiful breeding, although it's hard for me to know if he's got racing speed to match that lovely appearance of his, or is merely like those dogs that men keep at their tables, which their masters like to groom in order to make themselves grand. You replied to him then in turn, Eumaeus, my swineherd. Sure enough, this is the dog whose master died far away. If he were only the way he once was, his looks, the feats he'd perform, just as Odysseus left him when he went off to Troy. You yourself would marvel to behold his speed and strength. No beast that he ever chased in the deepest part of the woods could ever get away. He was also a great one for tracking, but now he's beset by trouble. Somewhere far off his master has perished, and the women are heedless and take no care of him. So saying, he went inside the bustling palace, going straight through the hall to join the lordly suitors. And Argos, his fate, black death, took him in its grip the moment he saw Odysseus after 20 years had passed. Thank you.
Is that on? Oh, that's on. I've prepared a bunch of questions. One of them actually starts with Argos. So let me see if we should just talk about
Everyone loves Argos.
Dog, of course.
Well, I mean, who could resist, right?
It is fabulous melodrama. Is the echo for you or only for me? Okay. So the gambit of the Odyssey is that this guy comes back after 20 years and is the same person he was. Highly implausible in a lot of ways. And the first recognition scene, of course, you just read, is the dog. That seems to guarantee his identity in what seems to me, or I think probably to us, a really implausible but deeply Greek way. Deeply Greek because the epithets guarantee that one character is always the same over time. And as I said, the narrative gambit of the Odyssey is that Odysseus still is fundamentally the same person. How does the Odyssey help us think about identity in the sort of complex ways of being the same person over time and yet different through change?
Well, I think the Odyssey is very interested in how we think about who we are through time. So, as you say, this guy's been away for 20 years, and the sort of punchline of the Odyssey is that when he finally gets home, he has to be recognized by the people he left behind. He has to recognize them too. I always tell my students, through no fault of their own, in certain ways, when you're 18 or 19 or 20, there are things about the Odyssey you can't understand because they've been separated for 20 years and you're not even 20 years old. You don't know what it's like to be away from someone for 20 years. I always say to them, you cannot understand the Odyssey until you've been to your 20th high school reunion. Then you know what it's like to have people come up to you that you used to know and you cannot recognize them. You know, you're like, I dated you? You know, you? So the Odyssey is very interested, I think, in a phenomenon that we know to be true from our own lives, which is a paradox. So as the Argos scene proves, which I just read, and there seems to be something about us that remains constant over time. So this poor dog who's now decrepit and neglected and no one pays attention to him anymore. The dog is like Odysseus, by the way, who also looks decrepit and neglected in his street person costume. And yet the dog somehow senses that it's Odysseus after all these years, lying there in the dung heap, and Odysseus is in disguise, and somehow he knows it's he. And I think that speaks to something that is true about the way we think about ourselves in our lives, which we are always, you know, I am always I to myself, and that remains constant, right? But yet, as we also know, and this is why you need to go to your 20th high school reunion, you change over time. Just time does things to you, right? Just time. Aside, and I'm not even talking about suffering and illness and shipwrecks and trauma and the things that Odysseus goes through, right? And I think the Odyssey understands that this is the central paradox of human life, which is you always feel like yourself, and yet you're always changing. And the story I like to tell about this is, so I told you about this book I wrote about this experience when my octogenarian father sat in on my freshman Odyssey class. And it just so happened that my mother turned 80 that semester. And in fact, it was a Friday in April that she turned 80. And the class that I taught that my dad was in met at 10 o'clock on Friday morning for 2.5 hours. And so before I went into class, I quickly called my mom on my cell phone because she would kill me if I didn't call her on her birthday early. And I said, happy birthday, blah, blah, blah. I said, how does it feel to be 80? And the answer she gave is the best description of what the Odyssey is about that I've ever heard. She said, you know, it's funny. Every morning I wake up and I go into the bathroom to wash my face, and I look in the mirror and I say, who is this old woman? Because inside I feel the same. And that is what the Odyssey is about. And the paradox of the Odyssey is he has to prove that he is the same person who left, but he isn't the same person who left. No one is the same person after 20 years. And I think the Odyssey is constantly revolving around that problem and understands that it's a kind of irresolvable paradox. You know, I mean, certainly we know that as we go through middle age into old age, right? You are both the same and different at the same time. And it's very interesting that Odysseus rejects two goddesses in favor of coming home to Penelope, who is immortal, which means she's going to age and die, Calypso and Circe. And Calypso, when they're breaking up, basically, you know, it says, are you crazy? Penelope is aging and she's going to be old and decrepit one day. And look at me, I'm a goddess. She can't possibly compete with me in her form or her figure. And gods are not only immortal, but they don't age. And I think that's very important because when he's finally reunited with Penelope, what allows them to recognize each other is not a physical thing, because it cannot be a physical thing. It's a shared secret. It's something they know. And that, I think, is very moving, because that's the thing that doesn't change. The inside of your head doesn't change. The outside of your head changes a lot. And I think it's very beautiful, actually.
Let's stick with recognition scenes. One of the most famous ones in the book is when the nurse, Eurycleia, recognizes Odysseus as she's washing his feet by the scar he received. And you've talked a lot about this, the ringtail, that the Odyssey goes back to narrate the moment he got the scar, and then goes back even further to narrate the reason why he went to see his grandfather and went on the boar hunt to get the scar. It's a fascinating moment because the nurse, and this is your reading, which I think is a wonderful reading, the nurse recognizes the scar, which proves that Odysseus is the same person he's always been. Yet Odysseus receives the scar, and it's described in the poem 3 times because he's rushing ahead in a very uncharacteristic gesture. So the scar that marks him as consistent in character is actually also the mark of his inconsistency of character.
Yeah, so there's a famous moment in book 19. So he's finally back, but disguised as a beggar, and he managed to infiltrate the palace to see what's been going on in the palace. And as a matter of ritual hospitality, he receives a foot bath from an elderly serving woman who happens to be the woman who was his nurse when he was a baby. And as she's bathing his feet, she sees this telltale scar that only Odysseus has, this scar, which we are told he received when he was a teenager on a boar hunt. And the narrative stops at that moment. So there's no moment where, they embrace each other and she says, "Oh, it's you," The narrative grinds to a halt, and then you get a very long flashback about how he got the scar in the first place when he was a teenager 30 years ago. How during a boar hunt, he rushed in front of everyone else, presumably because he wanted the glory of being the first one to spear the boar, and was gored by the boar. Now, one of the things the Odyssey is always reminding us about the adult Odysseus is he never exposes himself. He always holds back whenever there's danger and assesses the situation and scopes out the possibilities. So it's interesting that the scar, which proves who he is actually the result of an action that is uncharacteristic of him. And I think that's very interesting. But what I think is maybe even more interesting, which just occurred to me, is a scar that is a thing that changes over time, right? A scar starts as a bloody wound, and only over time does it become a scar. So even the thing which looks like the permanent marker of who he is itself, like him, affected and transformed over time. So it just gives you a sense of how preoccupied the Odyssey is with this question of how do you know who someone is when our bodies are subject to these constant changes. The other thing that's great about this scene is, whatever else it may represent, the fact that he's recognized by a symbol of suffering, right? A scar is the remains of a painful wound. And Odysseus always, even though we think of him as this great hero and he has all these adventures and he's constantly getting the better of whoever he happens to be thrown in with, whether it's a one-eyed giant or a seductive goddess or whatever, is that he is always associated with pain. You're constantly reminded that this homeward journey is not just, what I did on my summer vacation in Europe, but agonizing, right? That he suffers, he's a sufferer. And I think that also makes him feel very modern to us as a hero. That he's marked literally, as my students like to say, literally.
In this case, they're right.
In this case, it's right, but when they write it, it's always wrong. It's like the chicken literally crossed the road. I'm like, you don't need the word literally there. It's like, but literally what marks him is pain, right? He is the man of pain. And one of the things, so that scene that we're talking about where she recognizes the scar, the action grinds to a halt, you hear the story of the hunting expedition, how he got there. Then that story, and we're already back in time, grinds to a halt. And then you get the story of why he went on the hunting expedition, which turns out to be because of a promise that was made on the day he was born. He had a horrible grandfather who used to piss everybody off. And we get a flashback to the moment when he's born, and Eurycleia, the old lady who recognizes the scar in the present, is now a young nurse. And she takes the baby and she says to the grandfather, "What are we going to name this kid?" And he says, "Well, because I spent my whole life pissing people off, let's call him Off-Pisser," which is basically what the name Odysseus means in Greek. It means the person who causes a lot of aggravation to other people. But it also means, it has a passive meaning as well as an active meaning. It also means the person who suffers a lot of aggravation. So his actual name means pain. The meaning, you know, the word anodyne in English means something that's bland or painless. The odyne in anodyne is the same root as the Odys in Odysseus. It's the same word. It means pain, right? So this one recognition of the scar keeps circling back in time to give you more and more information of this character, every aspect of whom seems to be about pain somehow. It's kind of amazing.
This is another aspect of the poem that feels, I think, very modern. And you've written about this as you write about the Odyssey as suggesting what a heroism of survival might look like. And you write the depiction of the poem's protagonist as a gritty survivor who, in stark contrast to the haughty warriors of the Iliad, for whom dying young in battle is a fair price to pay for everlasting glory, will stoop to anything in order to stay alive, demands that we reevaluate what we mean by the word hero. And I think that's very interesting. This is about a post-war world, a post-heroic world, a very different conception of what it takes to get by than a battlefield.
Yeah. I think there's something, I mean, one of the reasons we're always going back to the Odyssey, I think, and I'm sure you've all heard that Christopher Nolan is making a movie of the Odyssey. They're already selling out performances a year in advance, apparently. One of the reasons we keep thinking about the Odyssey, aside from its intrinsic allure as an interesting story to read, is he seems like a very modern character. Not so much Achilles, I have to say. I certainly would not want to have Achilles over for dinner. I would love to have Odysseus over for dinner.
I think that's dangerous.
You know? But Achilles, with his ideas about heroism and glory and blah, blah, blah. Whereas Odysseus strikes us as very modern. He's a guy with a shifty identity, traveling through a world in which there are no rules anymore, right? When you're in the Trojan War, you know what the rules are. Every day you strap on your bronze armor, which I always think if you spend any time in Greece, I thought, God, talk about suffering. That must not have been a picnic, wearing bronze armor in the Greek summer. But you know, you put on your armor, you go out, you kill a guy in a very interesting way, and then you come back and you steal his armor and you take his stuff, and that proves how great you are. In the Odyssey, there are no rules anymore. There's no rules at home where everything is broken down, right? The whole social structure is gone. These guys are camping out in his house, breaking all the rules, trying to marry his wife who doesn't even know if she's a widow, actually. You know, it's all uncertainty. To say nothing of the places where he ends up, which are really gonzo, right? I mean, they're totally science fiction. One-eyed giants, you know, Scylla, Charybdis, seven-headed monster, you know. So all the certainties of the old world, the wartime world, have vanished. Even the gods have vanished. If you've read the Iliad, you know the gods are very much part of the action. They're fighting in the battles, they're hanging out with their favorite mortals, they're giving them advice. They're very mixed up in human affairs. In the Odyssey, all that has receded. There's only one god, really, who's interested in what's going on, and that's Athena, who is Odysseus's patron goddess. And she comes in and does stuff. But you feel the gods even are not so interested in what's going on. And that, I think, makes it feel like a very modern story. Like, how do you navigate a shifty landscape when you don't know what the rules are and you yourself are a person whose identity is constantly shifting as the occasion demands? And that feels much more, I think, contemporary to us than a character like Achilles in the Iliad, who has no doubts about who he is, you know.
And of course, the defining epithet for Odysseus is polytropous, always turning, always changing, as the moment requires, and also sometimes when it doesn't require. It's just who he is.
Yeah.
And that notion of the continual change, the continual turn, also feels very modern.
Yeah, he's
unstable.
The first adjective that is used of Odysseus in line 1 of the Odyssey is this funny Greek word polytropos. So poly means many, and tropos means a turn. So he's a man of many turns. It obviously describes his itinerary coming home, which is not a straight line, but it also describes the way his mind works, which is it's constantly turning things over, seeing things from different angles. He himself always looks different from scene to scene. You know, you just never know who this guy is or how he's going to approach a problem. And that makes him very interesting, I think.
I want to follow that up with the first line of your translation. And this is something one of my students, Eric Verin, who I think may be here. Hi, Eric. Thanks for this insight. Here's the first line of your translation. Tell me the tale of a man, Muse, who had so many roundabout ways to wander off course after sacking Troy's hollow keep. The line, if you read the first line, sounds like the many turnings are about Odysseus, but then the enjambment makes it clear that it's actually about the journey home.
Or also about the journey home.
Also about the journey home. So there's something echoing in the construction of the text and the hero that it's about that's really interesting.
Well, you know, this adjective that I just described is like the most famous problem in translating Greek literature.
Right.
Everyone has an idea about how to translate this word because the word itself has many meanings. And so if you remember before, I was talking about those kinds of lines that run over the end of one line and onto the next. So that's the first 2 words of the Odyssey, and Homer deploys that mechanism in a very purposeful. I'm just doing what Homer does. This isn't my idea. So when you read it in Greek, it says, tell me the tale of a man, Muse, the poet is talking to the goddess that he's getting inspiration from, who was polytropos, right? And it basically looks like you're saying, oh, tell me the story of this guy who had this very interesting way of thinking. But the line actually runs over, and the next word is, who wandered, you know, wandering so far, driven off course, right? So polytropos, that adjective, also describes the way his journey looked as he tried to get home, which involved lots of doubling back and going back to the same place and then trying to move forward and whatever. So I'm just doing what Homer does, you know, and that way he gets to have his cake and eat it too, right? It's a description of the hero, and it's also a description of the itinerary you're about to spend 24 books reading about, you know. I mean, the guy knew what he was doing, you know. I have to tell you the story about how, so anyone reviewing a translation of the Odyssey, the first thing they look at is, what are they going to do with polytropos? I've done it myself, so I know. And so for a long time, I thought I was going to translate that word as twisty. Tell me the tale of a man, Muse, who had so many twisty ways to wander, driven off course after sacking Troy's hallowed keep. And I kind of like that. But after it took me about 3 years to create the first draft of the translation. And then I spent another 2 years going over every word with my college mentor, who is a very great scholar of Homer, and particularly the Odyssey, Jenny Strauss Clay at the University of Virginia. And for 2.5 years, we had 2.5-hour Zoom meetings a week, literally looking at every word of the Greek and looking at my translation and arguing. And she never liked twisty. And I was literally a week before I was supposed to hand in the manuscript to my publisher, I was getting increasingly bothered by the fact that Jenny didn't like twisty, and I myself was starting to go sour on twisty, which I sort of like because it has twists, which is sort of curvy, but it was a little Dickensian, a little cute. And this is a true story. So I live in the Hudson Valley of New York, about 2 hours north of New York City. And there is a very complicated intersection nearby that they had converted to a roundabout. And because no one in the United States knows how to use a roundabout, except people from Boston, where they are very common. So I'm driving on this road, and the moron in front of me comes to a complete stop as he's entering the roundabout, which is not what they're for. And I literally said out loud, I said, God, no one knows how to use roundabouts. And I went, oh my God, roundabout. I love roundabout. You know, a person who has roundabout ways is a person who does not do things in a straightforward way, but I love that it had round in it. So that gets at the turn, right? And I pulled over to the side of the road after I got out of the roundabout. And no, where this thing is, there's like one of those texting stops, you know, like, do your texting here. I pulled over. I called Jenny. I said, what do you think about roundabout? And she's like, that I could live with, you know. And I changed it to roundabout, and I was happy, and that's how it ended up being roundabout. But everyone's always going to look at that.
We have a brand new roundabout on campus, so
and I'll
really
be standing there watching.
Appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah, that's right.
One last thing, and then I'm going to turn things over to the audience. This is shifting gears a bit.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I love about the earlier An Odyssey is your account of your seminar, which is charming and I'm sure idealized, although your students sound absolutely fabulous. But you have this passage that I think is great. It's about teaching, and I want to end with this. It was from Fred, a mentor, a friend of yours when you were younger, that I learned that beauty and pleasure are at the center of teaching. For the best teacher is the one who wants you to find meaning in the things that have given him pleasure too. So the appreciation of beauty will outlive him. In this way, because it arises from the acceptance of the inevitability of death, good teaching is like good parenting.
Yeah, I often say that being a teacher is just like being a parent. You're training young people to leave you, basically, right? You're giving them the equipment to be in the world in a way that you will ultimately not be able to watch or have any control over. And I think that's kind of great, right? You're giving them a set of tools and hoping that that will be enough to do what they need to do.
The difference is your materials are pleasure in teaching. That's not true with parents always.
Not always. Audience questions?
Audience questions. If anyone has a question, I don't know if do we have microphones or?
Well, if you ask questions, we can repeat them
Yeah.
back so everyone hears them. If anyone wants to get up and, oh no, we have a microphone in the audience.
There's a hand here.
I assume that you worked on your translation during COVID.
Yes.
Did that impact how you approached the text?
The fact that I worked on the translation during COVID, did it impact?
There was this period of maybe solitude that a lot of people were having.
Totally. I think I finished this twice as fast as I would have. No, I did. I mean, it was a very Odyssean experience, right? You know, I was alone, there was nothing to do, and suddenly I had all this, I was lucky, and I live in an isolated place in the country, and I really think that has a lot to do with, not just practically, but I think because the whole world was suffering, I was thinking a lot more about the suffering side of the Odyssey, and also, what it means to be isolated. That was the big word, right, during COVID, isolation. And of course, the thing that you're constantly being told throughout the Odyssey about Odysseus is that he's, alone in the middle of the sea, right? When he's on Calypso's island, it's described as being in the exact middle of the sea, which means nowhere, And so I guess I was thinking about that a lot, actually. Very interesting question. But it also, as we all know, you suddenly had scads of time because there were no meetings, there were no, colloquia, conferences, things like this. There was just nothing. And also you couldn't interact with people. So I think that sense of loneliness, Odysseus is alone for a lot of his return journey. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question.
Thank you. I'm a professor at John Adams College, which is in Provo, just about an hour south of here. Mm-hmm. And I spent some time also studying the Greek language in a master's program just recently. As I was reading through your translation of the Odyssey, there was one part that struck me as quite creative. This is when the recognition scene between Odysseus and Penelope, not quite to the recognition scene. He's still in disguise, and this is the first time talking to her. And in your translation, he starts to address her as my wife, and then stops and says lady. And I find this a fascinating translation because obviously the word for woman in Greek, gine, means both wife and woman. And I'm just curious, I don't know if this is working anymore, but what particularly inspired that, or other sort of creative translations similar to that?
Well, I think, so this, as you say, is the scene when Odysseus, he comes home, he's in disguise, but Penelope, like the dog, seems to sense that there's something very special about this decrepit beggar and keeps inviting her up to her room for cocktails every night. And when he first addressed her, in Greek, he says, "O gunai," gunai, which is, say, one of the roots of gynecology, right? It means both woman and wife. And when you read it in Greek, you realize that he could be slipping up and calling her my wife, or he could just be saying, "Oh, woman, listen to what I'm saying." But I needed a way to get across the double meaning of the word. So in my translation, he says, "Oh, what? W-I-woman," because I think it's important for the reader to be able to absorb what I can absorb because I know Greek, but the reader doesn't. So there are several times where I allowed not always, but there were times where I felt that these sort of double meanings, were important enough to actually put into the translation. So for example, in book 1, Penelope, who's sort of moping around like everybody else, wishing Odysseus were home, has a confrontation with her young son. It's not for the first time in history. And he sort of tries to be the guy and tells her off and tells her to go back up to her room and keep weaving. She has asserted herself, and he now is trying to be the man of the house. And he's like, "Go up and go to your loom," because that's what women do in this culture, they weave. "Go back to your loom." And in my translation, he says, "Go back to your loom as tall as a mast," the mast of a ship. Because in Greek, the word for loom is the same as the word for the mast of a ship. And it's very pointed in the Odyssey because Homer is always reminding you that the adventures that Odysseus has on his various ships as he battles his way home are paralleled by the adventures that Penelope has in the palace trying to fend off the suitors. So, at times like that, I sort of over-translate in a way to give the reader access to things that are happening in the Greek that I think you want to see right there. You don't have to look at a footnote in the back. So, yeah, it's a good question. Good question over here.
Modern lyric poet, and then you have a classic epic poet. What's the tension when you were trying to address them? Probably different idioms. Of course, I don't know Greek, but how did you think about that when you were addressing the text and just thinking about lyric poetry versus epic poetry and how that is addressed?
So, yeah, the only other translation, and also the only other translation I will ever do, was of a modern Greek poet, Constantine Cavafy, who is a lyric poet, not an epic poet, also writing in a language that is not the language of Homer, modern Greek. I don't know that there was that much the languages are so different, they're essentially different languages. And modern Greek, English, I know I just met a professor who works on Anglo-Saxon stuff, right? So English has traces of its ancestry as Middle English and Old English, but when you're translating English, modern English words, you're not necessarily hyper aware of those inheritances unless the poet wants you to be. So I don't, it's basically two different languages, I would say, and it's a very different kind of translating. I will say, though, that in my little spiel that I gave at the beginning of this evening, when I said what I tend to be interested as a translator, interested in, are in the modern Greek translation, like in my translation of Homer, I'm trying to pay attention to these formal things that are going on, the line, the sounds, that is the same. Because Cavafy, who is a modern poet writing at the beginning of the 20th century until the 1930s, is seen as a modernist. But for example, you would never know from the existing translations at this time when I started that translation, which is 20 years ago, that a lot of his poems are sonnets. They're strictly rhymed sonnets. So I was trying to sort of bring back the formal sense of what he's up to in these poems, because that's just something I'm interested in, So that is a shared preoccupation in both translations, even though they're very different poets writing in almost totally different languages. Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. Over there.
I have a question. As the imagery of the Odyssey has always been in the story of Odysseus telling his grand tale. Mm-hmm. And it's a wonderful image. It's very powerful for students to hear that. And then we get to Homer telling the story. How do you address to your students that this was a wholly oral presentation, and yet we have the written version of it, which of course is the only way we would ever know the words and know the story, but the magic of how do you say, how many lines? 21,000 lines? What did you say?
12,110.
12,000, 5 billion lines, yes. Could you talk about that a little bit, like the bridge between oral and the written?
That's a great question. So we know that these epics actually began in a pre-literate culture as poems that were composed orally without writing and memorized and expanded upon and growing through many retellings by many different poets until at some point somebody sort of pulled it all together, but they were originally oral. These people didn't have writing. which always astounds me because I can't even remember what I had for breakfast this morning, let alone memorizing 12,110 lines of poetry. So the way this is a really great question. So the way I tried to address that is one of the ways that those guys were able to memorize things is the rhythm, right? You had a rhythm which was very set, so you knew whatever you were going to say had to fit the rhythm, And I tried to, a lot of English translations, when you're translating into the blank verse, the short English line I was talking about before, ultimately start to sound like prose, just stacking up lines and cutting them off and making it look like poetry. That's a danger of that. But I try to work a very insistent rhythm into each of my lines so that as you read it, even as you read it to yourself, you feel that bouncy beat, which was think of rap. I always think rap is the best comparandum for that. There's a beat, it's going on, you have to fill it, you have to end with a rhyme, with the word, with the line before, So I tried to do that. And one of the features of oral poetry that was composed before writing, is precisely as a kind of mnemonic device. They evolve these sort of stock phrases that are repeated, not only phrases, but entire scenes are repeated verbatim over and like every time you have dinner in Homer, it's the same 5 lines. The same thing happens, the lady comes out with the platters, she puts them down, they pour the wine, it's just exactly verbatim. And those clearly evolved as sort of placeholders. So while you're reciting this very long thing, you knew, oh my God, I can get to line 30, I know what I'm doing, right? So those are traces of the evolution of the poem over time as an oral composition. Also, these epithets like rosy-fingered dawn and winged words and gray-eyed Athena and the wine-dark sea, right? That's a phrase everyone has heard. Those are also placeholders. They always come in the same position in the line. So the beginning of the line you're making up, that's where the action is, but you're going to land on Zeus, who marshals the clouds, and that gives you a little breather. I keep all that stuff verbatim the way it appears in the Greek. Many modern translators, because those repetitions seem very stiff to us, it's not how you would write now, right? We don't need reminders and, what's that thing called when you're mountain climbing and you stick that thing in the rock to hold on to? What are they called? Yeah. So that's what those are for the oral performing poet. They're the things that you stick in the rock to hold on to. So many translators make them dissolve away because they seem so foreign to us. So they vary these phrases or they find ways to sort of make them different each time to sort of make it more interesting. But I keep them exactly the same because it is an oral composition and I want the traces of that to be in the poem. Look, I've always, in all my writing, I think I have great faith in the intelligence of my readers. You pick up Homer's Odyssey, this is a 3,000-year-old artifact from a very different culture, and some of it is going to be weird. That's fine. I'm not trying to dumb it down and simplify it so it's palatable. You have to step up to it instead of dumbing it down. And so those are the things I thought were ways of nudging the reader to remember that this stuff came out of a very different kind of world than the world we think of as being how poems get constructed. That's a great question. Someone here had a hand up, I think.
Okay. So as a kid, my favorite story was of Polyphemus and when Odysseus calls himself nobody or no one and tricks him that way. And ever since then, I've just loved that story. And while I was reading your version, I noticed that the words "no one" cropped up many times. And I have it open. My favorite one is when he's talking to the swineherd about Odysseus, and he's, disguised. And the swineherd says, "Old sir, no one could come here after wandering far and wide." And I love it because you can replace that with Odysseus and say, "Old sir, Odysseus could come here after wandering far and wide." And you see that many times. Like when you read about Argos, I was wondering if is that intentional? Is that
Totally.
something that you, had a little giggle about, because that's what I did.
Totally. I mean, I actually have a note about this. So in the Odyssey, one of the weird things about the Odyssey, and this goes to what we were talking about before, that as Odysseus is a kind of man of 1,000 faces who has no stable identity, a very weird hallmark of the Odyssey is the Odyssey goes out of its way not to mention Odysseus's name in all the places you would imagine, including line 1. So you'd think of the way the Iliad opens. The Iliad opens, it says, "Sing to me, goddess, of the rage of Achilles, son of Peleus," which caused the bodies of many soldiers to be blah, 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 blah. And it ends, that little section ends, "Start from the moment when he stood forth in conflict with Agamemnon, the Lord of men." So it gives the name of the character and tell me where to start. The Odyssey begins, "Tell me about a man, the man who was polytropos and wandered around." And the end of that section is, "Start wherever you want." Literally, that's what it says, right? "Ton hamathenge thea," from any place you want. There's something very vague about the Odyssey's approach to its hero, which it doesn't name until much later. So not as only is he a man of many faces, he's a sort of a man without a name. And throughout the Odyssey, a pronoun is often used instead of Odysseus's name. There's a Greek pronoun, ekenos, or kenos, which means that guy. And even Penelope and Telemachus often will say, "Oh, I miss that guy." It's like they can't bring themselves to say his name. And as you noticed, and I'm so happy you noticed this, and I do write about this in my introduction, the same nobody that he uses to fool the Cyclops when he says, "My name is nobody," and then he blinds the Cyclops and the neighbors come running and they say, "Is anyone hurting you?" And he says, "Nobody's hurting me." And they're like, "Okay, we'll go home." So that's the famous trick. And the word for nobody that he uses there is outis, which is the Greek word for no one. But outis often occurs in many lines that can be read as a double meaning. Like in the passage with the swineherd, where the swine says, "Nobody's going to come home after many years wandering around." But it also is the same word that Odysseus used to identify himself, which is a way of saying, Odysseus is going to come home. And that happens very often in the Odyssey. And every time it happens in Greek, I reproduce it in English. Sometimes I put it in italics, so you sort of notice that it's a double entendre almost, right? But it's a very weird thing about this poem that it can't bring itself to say, in fact, in that same speech, if I'm remembering correctly, the swineherd himself says, "I cannot bring myself to say the name of my lost master." There's something about this guy's name, maybe because it means pissing everybody off. Nobody wants to say it. It's sort of rude, but it's very interesting. And I try to reproduce that as often as possible because it is a joke. It's a sort of ongoing joke. It's very weird. Yeah. Somebody else sort of right here, gentleman in the t-shirt.
I can talk loud enough, it's all right. This isn't a question about the final translation, but about the process of translating. As a kid, I wanted to read Beowulf, And my dad had a copy, but he had the Old English copy for some reason. I said, you know what, I'll be fine. You know, it's English. And I got to it. I didn't get far at all because Old English is not English. And it feels like a different language. So how did you go from learning a foreign language to learning the ancient version of that foreign language made 3,000 years ago? Did you learn some of it beforehand, or did you have to kind of grapple with that going through the process?
Well, I sort of did it backwards. I learned the ancient language before I learned ancient Greek way before I learned modern Greek, actually. And there's a famous problem that modern Greeks have, which is if you know modern Greek before and then you study ancient Greek, you're going to have a lot of problems. Because there are words that look familiar in ancient Greek, but they don't mean anything like what they now mean in modern Greek. Sometimes they're the same, right? No, I was a very nerdy kid. And I was already interested in ancient Greece when I was, 11 and 12. And I knew I wanted to study Greek. And I went to the University of Virginia as an undergrad, and I signed up for beginning Greek like on the first day. And I declared my classics major like 3 days later, like it was, pretty obvious what was going to happen. So when you learn ancient Greek, you learn typically a sort of classical Greek, which is like the Greek that Plato spoke and wrote in, and Euripides and Aeschylus and all the great figures. Homer's Greek is totally different from that language. It's almost like it's another language because it's much older. It's also, and this is worth saying, and I should have said it at the beginning of this evening's session, it is not a language anyone actually spoke. It was basically evolved only for poetry, right? And so it's very weird. It's like, what do they call that in geology when you cut through a stone and you see all the different layers? The strata, right? The strata, you can see in Homer's Greek, there are very old words, there are much newer words, there are, the grammar comes from different periods in the evolution of the Greek language. It's a mess. It's a hot mess. And also it's composed of many different dialects of Greek. So, Greece, as you may know, consists of a peninsula sticking into the Mediterranean Sea, but there's also a lot of islands. Each island had its own dialect. Each area had its own dialect. So it's just a messy thing. There's no way to give a sense of that in English. It would sound ridiculous. But Greeks of the later period all knew their Homer. It's like the Bible used to be throughout American culture. There was a period where everyone knew their Bible. I find that is not the case anymore from working with my students, not in Utah, but in New York. But, the way that the language of the King James Bible sounds to an English speaker's ear, it's weird, but it's also familiar, right? We're used to some of those phrases, those turns of phrase. I think that's how Homer sounded to sort of Joe or Jane Greek, in the historical period. So when you study Greek, first you learn a sort of standard Greek that was the Greek of classical Athens, basically. And then you can study Homeric Greek, which is really, you have to learn a whole other thing. It's weird, it's a weird language, but interesting. It's a good question. And I learned modern Greek, much, much later when I was a graduate student, because when you're a graduate student in classics, you spend a lot of time in Greece, getting up at 4 a.m. to look at tombs. And I just was spending so much time there. I thought it was sort of rude not to try to talk to these people in their own language, So I learned it much later.
This has been great. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. I think you want to sign some books?
Oh, I will be outside and available to sign the wrong book, which I highly recommend. An Odyssey, not the Odyssey.
It's worth reading, and then read the Odyssey. Thanks very much.